Awesome. So, like I mentioned before, my name is Peter Soroye. I am the Key Biodiversity Area Assessment and Outreach Coordinator. Um, and I'm really excited for today's webinar. I've been doing a lot of really amazing work on the KBA Canada program over the last years. And many of you have been following this for the last couple of years and know all about it. Others of you are new to it. But what we're really looking forward to do over the next couple of weeks and months and maybe longer is to start talking more and more about how we implement these KBAs across the country. How can we use the information from the KBA Canada program in conservation and other efforts across Canada? So as a refresher for those who know already, and as a quick lesson for those who are still getting up to speed, the Key Biodiversity Areas and the KBA Canada program is identifying sites that contribute significantly to the persistence of biodiversity. This is the technical definition that we've settled on after a lot of deliberation and meetings with many different groups at the global level and at the national level. This is the definition we use in the global KBA standard and the national KBA standard, that Bible that we use to identify KBAs within Canada. But what this means is that we're identifying areas that are important for nature. They're areas that are special for a species or an ecosystem and just contain something really special and really dope inside of it. Next slide, please. We have some very specific quantitative criteria that we use to identify these KBAs with. They're exclusively quantitative. We go through a rigorous and objective identification process for all of these areas. And we are identifying these KBAs because of either threatened species, a geographically restricted species, maybe the site is critical for a particular biological process, like migration or feeding or reproduction. And we're also identifying these sites for ecosystems as well. So we can identify them for geographically restricted ecosystems like the globally rare Albar ecosystems that we can find across Southern Ontario. We're identifying them for threatened ecosystems like some of the remnant native prairies and grassland habitats that we have across Alberta and Saskatchewan. And we can identify them for sites and for places that are pristine and where the ecosystem or ecological communities are unaltered relative to baselines, areas with a high ecological integrity. So there's a couple different criteria we use to identify these sites, but what they all have in common, like I mentioned before, is that they have something unique and special about the nature and biodiversity within them. And I think that's really the important thing. Some of these places need to be protected. Others of them don't. What's really exciting about the KBA program is that a lot of these areas are places where things are going well. They're the bright spots of conservation, where either because of decades of careful management or thousands of years of thoughtful stewardship, nature is doing pretty okay. And that's fun to see, always fun to see, and important to highlight. Of course, for other places that do need to be protected, KBAs won't add that protection. They won't add that a management prescription or conservation action by themselves, but we can use the information from the KBA program to help with this decision making and to support the actions that are going to be needed in some of these areas. Dan Kraus will talk a bit more in just a moment about some of these ways we can use KBAs in conservation like that. Next slide, please. Across the country, we're about 2 years into this program, and we have over 700 sites identified, many more on the way. We're trying to comprehensively identify these special areas for nature across Canada. And we have active regional coordinators working in Ontario, in Quebec, in British Columbia, in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the territories. And in places where we don't have active coordinators, we already have some work underway, and we're just waiting for funding to be able to continue along that work. But in a lot of these places, we're getting very close to identifying in a comprehensive way these special areas for nature. In Yukon, for example, we recently had 20 sites completely finish the KBA identification process. These sites went from the delineation and identification steps with experts. They went through a technical review process with even more experts, and they went through another formal general review process before being approved by our National Steering Committee to confirm that these areas are are significant for national or international biodiversity in Canada. A lot of these sites, these 20 sites, are highlighting a lot of special species, from sedges to dune flies to whitefish and caribou. And it's really special to have these sites confirmed, to have this information now available, the spatial information, the site information now available on our website to download. I'd really recommend, if you're interested, if you're in Yukon or doing work there and you think you can use some of this KBA information already, check out our site to learn how to download it and check it out there. Next slide, please. I think it's important to think about the actual sites that we're identifying, and so I'll spend just a little bit of time looking at one of these sites in Yukon, Tombstone Territorial Park KBA, where we've identified a KBA here, a Key Biodiversity Area, for a globally endemic species of the Ogilvy Mountain collared lemming, which is apparently an adorable lemming species. It's so rare that I could not find a picture of it, and so instead I have here a collared pika, which is also found at the site. This Tombstone Territorial Park KBA is not only a beautiful landscape, as you can see from this picture, but is a really important area for over 130 different bird species, for a variety of different mammals and other biodiversity elements as well. Next slide, please. So we're identifying these areas in a comprehensive way. We're well underway in a lot of parts of the country. And now we're thinking more and more about how we can use this information. This will be the subject of the next speakers, of Dan Kraus and Andrew Couturier, and we're really excited to hear from them. But before, I'd like to just give a couple ideas about the scope of how we can use this information, how we can use this KBA information. And I'll give a shout out as the inspiration for this slide and really this entire webinar series that we'll be kicking off today. I want to give a shout out to Sherman Boats, who at our Progress and Updates meeting in the summer for KBA Canada gave it a terrific presentation about where we can take KBAs next. So he inspired a lot of this slide, maybe unknowingly. But of course, when it comes to using these KBAs, using these areas on the map that we're mapping out, we can use them to support conservation decision making, whether for protected areas, whether for land use planning or acquisition. Dan Kraus will talk about a lot of this next in a few minutes. What's really exciting is that these KBAs can be used at virtually every level of government, from federal to provincial or territorial or municipal as well. It can be used by businesses to identify places to invest or to identify areas that they can modify practices or refine their practices. Excitingly, I think we can use the KBAs in a lot more broader ways than just decision making. When it comes to research or education, KBAs, I think there's a huge potential for partnerships and linkages there. Our Quebec KBA program is built around a partnership with academia and a partnership with Université de Sherbrooke and some researchers there. So the work of identifying KBAs is being led by these researchers. And this is creating some really exciting opportunities. Undergraduate courses and students are identifying these KBAs actually in Quebec right now. And I think there's a huge potential for mimicking this sort of partnership throughout Canada. A lot of these KBAs, whether for birds or for other cool biodiversity, will not be in rugged places like the Tombstone Territorial Park. A lot of these KBAs will be close to cities and not a far drive from them. And so I think there's a really exciting potential to bring students from classrooms, whether in university or even younger as well, out to these KBAs to learn about the nature and then to learn about the special and nationally or internationally significant wildlife and nature that's in these places as part of their education as well. And of course, there's so many ways to engage communities with KBAs, whether through encouraging stewardship, engaging landowners, supporting Indigenous communities and Indigenous and protected conserved areas, or bringing in community science as well and partnering community science with KBAs in different ways. Ultimately, I think we want to shift the culture as well, right? We want to use KBAs to inspire conservation action, to grow an appreciation for nature, to get people outside and recreating, to not only appreciate nature and engage with it more, but hopefully want to save it and want to conserve species much more. So there's a whole range of different ways we can use this information. The next speakers will dive a little more into this in more detail, But over the next couple of months, as part of this regular webinar series, the KBA monthly webinars that will be held over the next year, we'll dive into each one of these topics that I have listed here in more detail. We'll have speakers from a diversity of backgrounds, from municipal government, from community science programs, from academic partnerships, and more. A huge diversity of speakers that will be talking about different ways that we can implement KBAs and different ways that we can use the KBAs for conservation. Next slide, please. I'm really excited for the rest of the series. I'm really excited for the rest of today. And then I'm really excited to continue the conversations that we start today over the next months regularly. So if you're excited, if you're interested, please stay tuned and watch out for the next KBA webinars. On that note, I'm going to turn it over to our next presenter, Dan Kraus, who I'm really excited to hear from. Dan is the Director of National Conservation at KBA Canada, at WCS Canada, sorry. He manages the Wildlife Conservation Society Canada portfolio for several national initiatives, including key biodiversity areas, including One Health, biodiversity policy, natural climate solutions. He's been involved with the KBA program since basically the beginning, and he has a lot of exciting ideas for how we can use KBAs within Canadian conservation. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan now. Vicky, if you could stop sharing this PowerPoint, and I'll let Dan share his screen instead.
Great, thanks so much, Peter. Can you just confirm that you can see my slides before I get going?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much. I am also a sort of a new face to the Key Biodiversity Area program, coming off almost 19 years from the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And it took a lot to get me to leave Nature Conservancy of Canada, but certainly part of it was this Key Biodiversity Area program, which I really think is one of the most exciting conservation initiatives happening in Canada right now. What I'm going to do is kind of dive in a bit deeper into some of the ideas that Peter shared. As we start thinking about, going beyond just identifying these KBAs, but how we can actually use them for effective conservation. And I also want to acknowledge Sherman Boats from Acadian University. I saw his presentation back in the spring, very inspiring, and it really helped to kickstart some of my thinking about implementation. Now I'm going to start and actually end my presentation with a question. And the first question is, I just want you to kind of think about an important place that conserves biodiversity. My slides are not changing. Oh, there we go. For most people, you probably think about a park or a protected area. Might be a national park, a provincial park, or if you're involved in the land trust community, it might be a place like Bluebird Ranch on the Cardinalvar in Ontario that's owned and managed by the Couturier Conservancy. This makes sense when we come to thinking about conserving nature. In Canada, we have a long history of protected areas. Banff and Algonquin were among the world's first parks. We have the world's first National Park Service in Canada, and the direct land-based conservation actions of conservation groups extend back into the 1930s for Ducks Unlimited Canada and the 1960s for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. But there's another important layer of sites for nature. These are generally less well known. They often don't have nice signs, but they both overlap and complement parks and protected areas. Biodiversity designations also occur across Canada. Now, some of these are global, like the Delta Marsh Ramsar site in Manitoba. Some are national, like the Main River Canadian Heritage River in Newfoundland and Labrador. And many are provincial or even regional, like the Brookville Swamp Provincially Significant Wetland that's at the back of my property in Halton Region in the traditional lands of the Mississauga of the Credit. The biodiversity conservation designations are a more recent concept than protected areas. The first international biological program sites weren't identified in Canada until the late 1960s, and we didn't have a Ramsar wetland site of international importance until 1981. Now, key biodiversities are part of this group. They're inspired by the success of important bird areas and will eventually incorporate several of these designations. So we have one biodiversity designation brand that includes all the key sites that need attention if we're going to stop the loss of nature. As Peter said, these are generally not protected by a government agency or a land trust, and their boundaries aren't enshrined by some legal mechanism. So the question I often get is, do these biodiversity designations work, and how effective are they? Well, we're going to hear from Andrew and Amanda about how important bird areas are effective, but I think as we think about moving from identification to implementation of KBAs, there is this emerging literature on the effectiveness of biodiversity designations that we can learn from, that we need to learn from. And while some outcomes are mixed and there's generally no control sites, nobody puts a Ramsar designation on just half of the significant wetland just to see what happens to the other half. The consensus is that biodiversity designations are effective and they are an important mechanism in our conservation toolbox. So what can we do? What can you do to implement effective conservation in a key biodiversity area? So before we think about that question, I just want to step back and think about another question. And that question is, what are the conditions that actually enable effective conservation? And this is an important question for KBAs, since the goal of each and every KBA that gets identified is to make a significant contribution to the global or national persistence of biodiversity. So this question of effective conservation is something I thought about a lot when I worked at Nature Conservancy of Canada, because there were places where nature was headed in the right direction, bright spots, as Peter said, where wildlife and habitats were doing better than a decade ago. And then there were other places where that downward declining trend of biodiversity just seemed impossible to bend upward. Now, in the places where I observed that seemed to be working, there were 4 enabling factors that were driving effective conservation. There was the capacity to identify and conserve key areas. There was sustainable use of lands and waters. There were supportive laws, policies, and programs. And finally, there was a community that cared. And when each of these cornerstones were in place, effective conservation would happen. If you weaken or if one of the pillars collapses, the entire platform of effective nature conservation becomes unstable. So what gets me really excited about key biodiversity areas is that they can help to build and reinforce each of these pillars. So probably the most obvious application of KBAs is that they can guide land securement and land protection. At a national level, as we strive to conserve 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, KBAs can help to ensure that we stay focused on what we must protect rather than just what we can protect. They'll provide a set of preloaded conservation priorities that can help guide Indigenous protected and conserved areas and the work of land trusts across Canada. Even within existing protected areas, such as Bruce Peninsula National Park, they can help guide management by identifying the species and ecosystems that are not just important for maintaining ecological integrity within the park, but are also critical for national and global biodiversity conservation goals. Key biodiversity areas may straddle park boundaries and support management actions in the greater park ecosystem. KBAs can also support nature outside of the 30% that we're striving to protect. They can set a clear blueprint of where development can occur and where it should definitely not occur. This is good for conservation, but it's also good for business to have clarity on where these no-go zones are early in their feasibility studies and planning process. The global guidelines in business and KBAs could be adopted and modified in Canada to help businesses to understand KBAs and their importance in making decisions that reduce risk exposure and support nature conservation. KBAs can also be used to guide environmental impact assessments and to help direct biodiversity offsets for impacts that cannot be avoided or mitigated on site. And they can also help industry groups, corporations, and governments to set and measure sustainability goals. Key biodiversity areas can also help guide conservation outside of their boundaries. KBAs need to be embedded within a broader ecological network that includes corridors to support migration, genetic exchange, and range shifts, now accelerated by climate change. As we start to think more about regional and even envision a national ecological corridor system, KBAs can be part of the core areas, the nodes that system connects. KBAs are also important in terms of developing laws and policies. They can help governments at all levels in land use planning, land use policies, and zoning. The pedigree of a KBA with its rigorous standard and review can help local governments to better plan and defend natural heritage systems and green spaces in official plans. KBAs can also be used to focus programs that support farmers, ranchers, and landowners through stewardship support and tax incentive programs to help recognize and reward the thousands of acts of private land stewardship for nature that occur across Canada every day. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, KBAs can help to rally a community that cares. KBAs in southern Canada, particularly those in and near urban areas, can serve as gateways to help people connect with nature and learn about globally and nationally important species and ecosystems in their backyard and in their country. A recent paper on improving the effectiveness of Ramsar sites recommended more focused attention on developing vision and objectives with regular reporting on key indicators to guide management. Developing community-based conservation plans for each KBA or groups of KBAs, perhaps using the open standards for the practice of conservation, would be a way to develop objectives and indicators to guide management and monitoring. And perhaps just as important, would provide an opportunity to bring people together to share their experiences and ideas about protecting their local KBAs. These KBA conservation plans could even support implementation of the Species at Risk Act by also serving as action plans to implement recovery strategies. So often, Canadian students of biology, ecology, or conservation dream of working somewhere else to help stem the loss of nature. But KBAs offer a way to encourage research on places where here at home are just as important as tropical rainforests or coral reefs or elephants for conservation. In addition to creating knowledge to inform management, those researchers will become advocates for the protection of the KBAs that they studied. One of the strengths of KBAs is that there is no conservation recipe, no management overlord. Approaches and actions can be tailored to the local needs and community values. This means that there will be hundreds of conservation experiments happening across the country, and we have the opportunity to share our successes and challenges and be informed and inspired by the actions of others. Maybe the most important aspect of KBAs is that they can be integrated into the identity of communities. Now, we should not underestimate the impact of how a global or national stamp of recognition of what makes a place special can inspire local pride and action. In the long term, these may be places that don't just get protection through planning or laws or stewardship, but they become so ingrained in local identity and sense of place that their conservation becomes a culture. The post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is calling for a transformation in our relationship with nature, and KBAs may be the place where that seed can set. Perhaps they will become places that are part of the emerging concept of granting rights to nature, or even in the future, places that are considered sacred. Now, of these four pillars of effective conservation, it's communities and engaging people that matters the most. Without a collective consciousness that values nature and demands better for nature, there won't be more protected areas, sustainable development will be greenwashed, and politicians won't pass nature-positive laws. The new conservation that the world so urgently needs all of us. And I'd encourage you to ponder this last question. What can you do to help conserve KBAs in your community? Thanks.
That was terrific. Thank you so much, Dan, for an excellent presentation and for sparking so many questions and ideas that I'm sure we'll talk about in a couple of minutes after the next one. But before we reach that discussion period, let me introduce our next speaker today, Andrew Couturier, who is the Senior Director of Landscape Science and Conservation at Birds Canada. Andrew is a Fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, a member of our KBA Canada National Steering Committee. He represents Birds Canada on numerous other regional, national, and international conservation initiatives. And maybe not presenting with him, but also present today and who will participate in the discussion is Amanda Beichel, who is the Ontario Important Bird and Biodiversity Areas Coordinator. Amanda coordinates the IBA Caretaker Program, which is the group of on-the-ground stewards for Ontario and Canadian important bird and biodiversity areas. Both Andrew and Amanda are incredible leaders of the KBA program and are leading the transition from IBAs to the KBA system here in Canada. So without further ado, Andrew and Amanda, take it away.
Thanks, Peter. Just confirming you can hear me and see my first slide there. Yeah, good. Thank you. I'm also going to start my timer here so I don't ramble on too long and wait for your cue as well. So thanks for that introduction, and the and to Dan also for, and to both of you for your presentations preceding this one. What we're going to do here is go back in time a little bit and tell you some of the lessons that we've learned from more than 20 years of experience with IBAs, the forerunner to KBAs, and really focus in quite a bit more on this this community aspect that has been mentioned in the previous two talks, and that'll serve also as a stepping stone to future webinars as well. Here we go. Yep, I think I did that right. So take-home messages for this particular talk. IBAs really are the forerunner to KBAs, as we heard. They have a solid foundation built on more than 40 years of experience internationally, and they just represent a really good, solid science-based foundation for the KBA enterprise globally and in Canada, where we have a very rich history of use of IBAs for influencing conservation. But we think that the evolution to KBAs will only strengthen the case for conservation. As we heard, KBAs are being adopted internationally and also by governments in Canada as key tools for conserving key sites. And I really think we're on the cusp of a once-in-a-generation type of opportunity here to secure lands and waters that are really important for our for all nature. Really, the signs are there internationally and here with our own government that action is needed, and KBAs are a wonderful tool to make that happen. So some of you may know that over the last 40 years or so, more than 12,000 IBAs have been identified around the world, both on land and at sea, as you can see in this graphic. And this has been done in more than 200 countries and territories. And if you go on the world database of KBAs as it stands now, you'll notice that upwards of 75% of the world's KBAs that have been identified so far are in fact IBAs that have been transferred over into this new system. So it's really forming a core element of this new KBA system. So looking at Canada then, we have identified approximately 600 sites. 200 or more of those have some sort of formal protection. So this does not include things like OECMs or other types of stewardship occurring at sites, but 200 have some kind of formalized protection. Again, 20 plus years of work at IBAs, millions of dollars invested. We know there's a strong overlap with federally listed species of all taxa, not just birds. Our own analyses have shown that in the last number of years. So it's just a natural stepping stone to look at IBAs as KBAs as well. And of course, the caretaker network, the part that I want to talk more about today, is a fixture of this program. So just to give you a flavor of the management and implementation of the IBA program and how it was done. We have national partners who lead the overall direction, coordination, developing standards, databases, maps, websites, doing the national advocacy and communication, dovetailing with international protocols and needs. And then we also have a suite of what we call regional partners working in provinces, usually by province. And this is really needed to help implement the program on the ground, because the national partners can't be everywhere. And in any case, it's better to have local representation working on sites. And if we go down to the very bottom level, or the very base of the pyramid, are the caretaker groups that that are passionate about sites and really do the hard work of the monitoring and advocacy and work on the ground. And the photo on the right is a picture of one of our caretaker groups at one of our sites that I'll talk about a bit more. So reflecting back on what the IBA program did well over the last 20+ years, the website that contains all the maps and the data and the monitoring information that people rely on for finding information about these sites when development is proposed or there's some kind of action needed. Monitoring was very well taken up by our community of interest. 67% of our IBAs we consider adequately monitored by about 6,200 people every year through programs such as eBird and bird atlases and marsh monitoring program and so on. The IBA Local Action Fund, this was a small grants program that we ran maybe, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago. There was a funder that was interested in seeing conservation be advanced at particular sites that had a high importance for birds and or high threats. And that ran for a couple of years and funded some, well, I'll show you some of the projects it funded in the next few slides. IBAs have had some success in policy making. The wind energy guidelines back in the early 2000s stipulated that no wind energy developments should occur in IBAs, and IBAs are well known within the environmental consulting community as a layer that should be consulted when considering development processes. And of course, again, the the caretaker aspect of having approximately half of our sites supported through this caretaker network. And here you can see the map of where these sites are on the landscape. And again, the role of the caretaker groups is really runs the full gamut of anything really that could occur at a site, whatever is needed for conservation. Sometimes little action is actually needed, but at other times there might be, thanks Peter, there might be monitoring, there might be education, there might be signage that's needed, restoration, advocacy work, and advocating for outright protection. So I just have a couple of case studies to show you of places where a lot of action has occurred. And probably I would say the flagship of the IBA program, and indeed the coming KBA program, is the Fraser River estuary in British Columbia on the doorstep of Vancouver. Just a fantastic site from a biodiversity perspective, 102 species at risk, spanning fish, birds, plants, insects, you name it. Categorized as an IBA in danger by BirdLife International. It's an important, highly important site along the west coast of the Americas, a stepping stone for migrating shorebirds, water birds, etc. And right now there is a very focused campaign going on in this area to try and work with municipal governments, provincial and federal, on conserving the lands and waters that form part of this site. And this includes advocacy, letter writing campaigns, research, citizen science, you name it. There's a ton going on in this particular site, and it's a very important one within the network. Another example is in Ontario, the Niagara River corridor, spanning the full length of the Niagara River, including Niagara Falls. This site is, again, highly important for birds, but also for plants, There's a Ramsar site application in right now that we're supporting. There's annual festivals in terms of birds. And we have a lot of other things planned for this site. There's probably a dozen groups working in this group. It's our only binational IBA and KBA so far. And so we're working with US partners as well on this. Do you want me to wrap it up, Peter? Keep going. All right.
Yeah. Go through your.
I saw your video on, so my timer shows another 2 minutes. So, and another really great example is the Prince Edward County South Shore IBA. Sometimes you have people who are so passionate and the threats are so high that they come together in a way that wasn't envisioned initially, but nevertheless, this group came together with the support of Nature Canada and Birds Canada as well, to protect, and the local groups acting there, of course, they're the leading the charge on this, to protect the lands within this particular IBA. It's again another spectacular site for birds, but also will be important for other taxonomic groups. So they formed their own NGO and have splintered off into this entity of its own, and it's quite impressive, all the work that they're doing, including involving all the businesses in the community, the government, nature organizations, etc. And there are other examples. I'm just going to skip ahead here because we're running short on time. Another IBA that is a shoe-in for KBA status, spanning other taxonomic groups. It's a Ramsar site. Dan mentioned this in his talk. Bird blitzes, bio blitzes can be done here, cleanups, etc. So there's a lot of actions that could occur. And this is my final slide. Opportunities, there are tons of opportunities with this. We've heard about some of them. I do want to mention the KBA Secretariat is a coalition of 3 organizations at the moment: Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada, NatureServe Canada, and Birds Canada. And what I wanted to mention here is these 3 groups have never worked together before. So, oh, there's my timer. And so that alone is a really interesting outcome of working on KBAs, these 3 big NGOs working together. Of course, the coalition includes a wider array of conservation organizations, and we're all on board working together on this. We see this as a really unique opportunity to extend our audience away from just the core birders and expanding to all naturalists who are interested in all nature, and leveraging the different types of funding and informing businesses, as was mentioned in a previous example. So the sky's the limit, we think, on this KBA initiative, and we're really excited about it and hope you are too. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was a terrific presentation again. As a note to everybody, we'll be diving into the caretaker program in more detail in a future webinar coming up, and hopefully some of those sites as well, because you showed some terrific examples and case studies there too. So thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you, of course, as well to Dan. I'll ask all the presenters to unmute themselves and turn back on their video if you'd like. And I'm also going to allow all the attendees to unmute themselves and turn on their video if you'd like as well. Because what we'll do is go into the discussion period. So I want to keep a lot of time open for not only questions, but hopefully discussions with all the attendees here. A lot of you in the audience have been involved for just as long as any of us with the KBA program, and have participated in and contributed to the KBAs already in a big way. And so we're excited to hear your thoughts and what you're looking forward to in the KBA program. So I guess we'll start off by addressing some of the questions that we have in the chat already. Let me start off with a question here about the IBA KBA site maps, which this attendee noted were conspicuously absent of areas identified in the boreal forest. Although often considered intact, the boreal is actually fragmented over much of its area. How are areas being identified in this boreal? Andrew, do you want to jump in there first?
Yeah, I'll jump in and just say, yes, that was the IBA map that Randy, thanks Randy, was pointing out. And yes, that is a conspicuous absence and limitation of the IBA criteria as we applied them in the late 90s and 2000s. Thankfully, for the KBA process, there is a criterion known as Criterion C, which focuses on ecological integrity. And there is a group, someone may want to chime in from WCS about this, working on that criterion, which would encompass large areas of the boreal. And it's a data-driven modeling type of process, and it's underway but not finished yet. But we do expect those gaps to be filled in through this new process, because it's a conspicuous absence for sure.
To build off that just a little bit more, our ecosystem coordinator, Lucy Poley, is leading that work on ecosystem criteria and identifying sites based off of ecological integrity. And one of the difficulties there is, like you mentioned, a lot of the boreal is fragmented, and so identifying which parts of the boreal are most important to identify as KBAs there, as we can only have 2 of these large ecosystem criteria sites within an ecoregion. So work that's underway. If you're interested, do reach out and we can follow up more, and that also how conservation will be managed within these much bigger sites will probably also be the topic of a future webinar as well. Next question in the chat here, and as well, if you'd like to ask your question in person, just raise your hand and we'll quiet up and let you ask as well. So feel free to do that if you'd like. But question here from Paige Cowell, are the species observations and monitoring data from various sources consolidated into one data set through the KBA? And is this publicly available? We'll have a slightly different answer for birds and non-birds here. So let me start off maybe with how we're doing this for the things other than birds. For that, a lot of our data in this process is coming from NatureServe, collaborations with NatureServe and the conservation data centers or natural heritage information centers across Canada. We also are getting a lot of data from researchers and other organizations too, and individuals. All of this is compiled into one data set for us that we use to scope out where these KBAs might be. But equally important to that is the knowledge of people on the ground that we use to really finalize every single one of these KBAs. That data set isn't publicly available. A lot of it is confidential, given the threat status of a lot of these species and the nature of some of this data. But a lot of it is. We're also pulling in data from iNaturalist and other sources too that a lot of it is available. In the eventual, when we produce these KBAs, for example, for Yukon, if you visit our KBA dashboard on kbacanada.org, you can see the outline of these final KBAs. So once the KBAs are confirmed and accepted, we upload that spatial data and it's available to download, to view. And we also have some information on the site itself and the species within it as much as we're able as well. But for birds, just because of the history of bird data, this is a slightly different. So I'll let Amanda or Andrew chime in there too.
You want me to? Oh,
I can take this one, so I'm not just along for the ride. So although Peter's right, they are working, we're kind of working separately, but in the background, we are working on kind of combining those data sets as well and making it publicly accessible. So we are working on a pretty awesome website that will not only be a website, but a tool where you can access this public data, and it will include all taxa and ecosystem that triggers KBAs. So I thought that was a really good question, and we're really excited to share that when it does become active.
A related question coming in about the IBA to KBA crosswalk process to determine which IBAs will qualify as KBAs and what the plan is for IBAs that are not qualifying. And I'll start out by saying, I know we're intending to have some more outreach with, especially the caretakers and other volunteers, especially within the IBAs about this. But Amanda or Andrew, do you want to maybe take the lead on answering that question for now?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? So the IBA KBA crosswalk process, I'll answer that first. We're still trying to reach out to experts across Canada to gather data for mostly data deficient sites. So we do have a suite of IBAs that have really great up-to-date data, but there are some other ones that are data deficient. So we're still working on that for those of you who don't know what the IBA to KBA crosswalk is. So we are still working on that, and we will soon have someone new, a new employee who's going to jump on board and be working on that full time. And then, yes, to determine which. So right now, I don't know that there's a solid plan for IBAs that don't qualify to become KBAs, but they're not just going to disappear. So we're still kind of working on exactly what that's going to look like, but it is going to be somewhat of a transition over the next few years, and they're not just going to disappear or anything. There's always going to be a chance to, if there's new data that becomes available or new surveys or anything like that, to add that data in there and, renominate it as a KBA if it doesn't qualify right now. Did I answer that all right, Andrew? You have anything to add?
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question up here regarding criteria. Could we expand on examples of biological processes and how these are used to identify KBAs? Let me answer this one first, and then anybody else feel free to jump in. But a lot of the sites, well, for birds, there are a lot of great examples of biological processes triggering KBAs. For other animals, other elements of biodiversity, things like denning sites or hibernacula for bats or snakes are examples of what might trigger a key biodiversity area in a region. Other things, a lot of these biological processes have to do with aggregations of species. So when we see incredibly large numbers of the national or global population of a species coming together in a single area for some sort of biological process. So that could be, denning sites for things like polar bears, certain areas that are really critical for caribou migration, or denning snakes or hibernacula for rare garter snakes or other sorts of animals. Would any of the bird folks like to elaborate a little on that as well, or?
Well, we could point to the Niagara River example that I mentioned there in the talk. Bonaparte's gulls, they're dispersed during their breeding season in the boreal forest. That's where they nest. But in the fall and winter, they come down and they all congregate in the Niagara River. So you get tens of thousands of them focused right in this one area. So that's an example of aggregating at a particular time of year during a particular part of their life cycle. And so that qualifies as a KBA for that aspect at that particular time of year.
I'll just add to that. I know Greg works around the Great Lakes, and I think in terms of bird, maybe ones for fishes in terms of aggregations or even refugia. I think for a lot of the fishes we don't have maybe enough information, but some of the globally imperiled ciscos or other fishes, I mean, they may actually kind of aggregate seasonally in some areas, which could qualify as KBAs as well.
Thank you, everyone. Next question I'm seeing in the chat here is, what's the best way for members of the general public to get involved, and particularly kids? I think this is something we're really excited to expand, is different ways for members of the public to get involved in KBAs. At the moment, the IBA Caretaker is a great example of one program that you can reach out to for an IBA or KBA in your region and get involved with. And in other ways, I think we're still developing a lot of these ways to be concretely involved with KBAs as members of the public. Certainly, there are ways to visit them at the moment. A lot of these places already have a history, like Dan pointed out, whether they're conservation areas or provincial parks or even lesser known areas where there's even smaller interpretive trails or other things. If you'd like to see get a broad indication of the sites that we're looking at the moment, Amanda dropped in the maps for IBAs and KBAs in progress in the chat a little further up. So do scroll up the chat and check those out. Those have the maps of where we're looking at KBAs and IBAs at the moment. And Andrew, feel free to jump in, and anybody else, Dan or Amanda as well.
I just had one thought about people getting involved. A good way to do that is through programs such as eBird. You know, you go out to a site, you count the birds that you see, you enter them in a system, whether it's eBird or iNaturalist for other critters. And so that's a really easy way to introduce people to nature and to get them interested in a particular site. It doesn't require a huge investment. It just you're going for a walk basically, and writing down what you see. But the data have value.
And learning about them as well. iNaturalist in particular has a great AI identification, and so it's the simplest thing in the world to snap a photo and figure out exactly what it is, which is absolutely amazing and mind-blowing, and a great way to learn more about the world around you too. I'll note as well, if you check up to our website and subscribe to our newsletter, you'll see you'll get a notice of different talks that are coming up. We have a couple of talks in the next couple of months towards general audiences and kids as well. And so if you're interested, reach out either to me or check out our website and subscribe to the newsletter, and you'll get a notice of those when they come up. Next question up here on the chat is again about the IBA to KBA crosswalk. So I'll let Andrew and Amanda take the lead on answering this one. But the IBA to KBA crosswalk will take money for surveys of remote seabird colonies in BC. A lot of the sites have not been surveyed since the 1980s. Will dollars be found? Another easy question, sarcastically.
Yes, an easy one. Yes, you're right, Anne. And this is a problem that we're encountering in many places. These remote seabird colonies, the far north, Atlantic Canada too. These places were surveyed by Environment Canada people probably a long time ago. We don't have the new data, if there is any new data even. And so these places are kind of in limbo that way. Although we are allowed to rely on expert opinion to say, even though we don't have new data to suggest otherwise, they continue as IBAs and KBAs. So there is hope that we could still use them as advance them forward as KBAs based on some kind of expert opinion if we don't have the data, assuming the habitat hasn't changed and all of that. We can make the case that they should become KBAs, and then we will. I mean, will dollars be found? That's something I can't really answer. And hopefully, we can convince our partners at Environment Canada that this is an important thing that should be done, and maybe that'll result in bear some fruit, but it remains to be seen.
Peter, can I chime in on that?
Please do, Ian. Yeah.
Folks, I'm Ian Adams. I'm the KBA coordinator, regional coordinator in British Columbia. And one of the, I think, finding some novel ways of doing some of that remote work are possible. It's recently, I think it was out of Britain, has a walrus from space program where they're using remote sensing images and putting that out to people online who can sit at home and count walruses from high resolution satellite imagery. So something like that can hopefully be used to keep costs down and get us at least some level of data on these remote sites.
Thank you. We're coming up close to the end of the hour. And I don't want to keep anyone longer than that, because I know we're all have to head on to other meetings, or hopefully head outside and enjoy some of this gorgeous day that we have out in nature around. I'll ask one more question to Dan. Could you give an example on how KBAs might help incentivize programs, might help design incentive programs, and how we could use KBA identification for sustainable use?
Yeah, that's a good question, Maria. I dropped the link to the KBA and business website in the chat, and there's some great global examples there. But I think in terms of incentive programs, I mean, there are existing incentive programs where people get tax rebates if they have certain natural heritage designations on their properties. I could see eventually KBAs becoming part of that. And for sustainable use, I think it is going to be a really valuable tool to kind of proactively identify these important areas. So for forestry, energy, mining, they'll kind of know where these important places are early on in the planning process, and hopefully eventually become advocates to help protect those places. So I think there is a real important role for KBAs in sustainable development, and allowing us to talk about the importance of these places early on in the planning process, and not when it gets further down the road and things can become more of a conflict.
Thank you so much, Dan, for a succinct and comprehensive answer to that question. I think that'll be the last question we'll have time to get to today, unfortunately. I think everybody here is really excited to continue this conversation in future webinars. I would encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter and watch out for the next monthly webinars that we'll have coming up. They'll usually be around the third Thursday of the month. So do pay attention to those as they come. Thank you everybody for attending today. Thank you for joining into the conversation, for asking questions. Thank you so much to our panelists for some absolutely brilliant presentations and answers to people's questions here.
Yes. Thanks for all of those great questions. It's good to see people excited about this.
Very much. Once again, we'll be sharing the link. We'll be uploading the recording of this talk to YouTube. So if you missed some of it, you want to watch it again, you can see it there. If you're subscribed to the Eventbrite, you'll get a link to it and to the PowerPoint slides. And if you're not, send me an email, psoroye@wcs.org, and I can get that to you afterwards. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.